Կրկնակի էքսպրեսո վիվարոից ստացեք մաքուր շաումի մինչև 50% չափով էքսպրես բոնուս։
Գործընկերներ եւ Արցանց հետևորդներ, այսօր մեդիա կենտրոնը կանցկացնի առցանց քննարկում 2020 թվականի հակաարևմտյան, հակալիբերալ տրամադրությունները Կովկասում, պրոպագանդայի խոհանոցի ներսում թեմայով։ Ներկայացնեմ մեր բանախոսներին Զարինե Խարազյան, Atlantic խորհրդի Digital Forensic Research Lab-ի խմբագիր, Գիգի Թաշվիլի, Atlantic խորհրդի հետազոտող, Արմեն Գրիգորյան, քաղաքականության հետազոտական կենտրոնի փոխնախագահ։ Բարև ձեզ հարգելի բանախոսներ, շնորհակալ եմ մեդիա կենտրոնի հրավերն ընդունելու համար եւ այսպես արեմուտքի ենթադրյալ բարոյական անկումը արդեն շուրջ 2 տասնամյակ հայկական քաղաքական դիսկուրսում քարոզչության հիմնական թեմաներից է, այսպես կոչված չար արևմուտքի պատմույթը նկատելի է դեռևս 1999 թվականից սկսած, երբ ՆԱՏՕ-ն ներխուժեց Կոսովո, այն քարոզչական մեծ թափ ստացավ մասնավորապես հետխորհրդային երկրներում իշխանափոխության հանգեցրած հեղափոխություններից հետո։ Ընդհանուր առմամբ նարատիվները, դավադրության տեսությունները իհարկե հնուց ի վեր քաղաքականության մաս են կազմել, մասնավորապես Հայաստանում 2018-ի հեղափոխությունից հետո նոր դավադրական տեսություններ ի հայտ եկան, առաջ քաշվեցին Արցախյան պատերազմում, երբ ունեցանք մեծ թվով զոհեր, վիրավորներ, կորուստներ, ավելի սրտեցին այդ պատմույթները։ Եվ հարգելի բանախոսներ, առաջին հարցը բոլորի դեմ ուղղում Արցախյան պատերազմից հետո, ինչպես նշեցի, ուժ գնացավ դավադրության տեսությունների պատմույթները, որի համատեքստում նաև շարունակում է թիրախավորվել հասարակությունը, ինչպես նաև թիրախավորվում են առանձին հասարակական գործիչներ, լրագրողներ, մեդիաներ, անհատներ։ Հետաքրքիր է ձեր փորձագիտական գնահատականով կա արդյոք օրինաչափություն Կովկասում, որ դավադրության տեսությունները բուռն զարգացում են ապրում քաղաքական ցնցումներից հետո եւ ինչ ընդհանրություններ ու տարբերություններ կան այդ նարատիվներում Կովկասում, Վրաստանում, Հայաստանում, խնդրեմ։ Գիվի
Sure, I guess I can start. Yeah, I do think there has been an intensification of a lot of the conspiracy theories and disinformation that we've just seen in the region for a long time. And that's to be expected because conspiracy theories and disinformation thrive during these crisis events when there's essentially an information vacuum, little access to reliable information, people don't know what's going on, and an armed conflict, a war, is the perfect scenario to allow those sort of narratives to flourish. In terms of what I have seen a lot of Russian fringe websites, as well as some domestic Armenian outlets throughout the war, push articles, for example, claiming that the Nikol Pashinyan is an agent of the West, for example, and also continuous attacks on for example, the LGBT community, as well as human rights activists and any Western-funded organizations in Armenia.
Okay, I can jump in. First of all, thanks for inviting. It's a great pleasure to be one of the panelists on this event today. I would say that Nagorno-Karabakh war was definitely a quite sensitive event also for Georgia, because we knew that situation was quite unpredictable, and we expected that it would end quite fast, and we would not really kind of being involved in this conflict in any shape or form. So basically, we in Georgia observed a couple of narratives which were not really like backed up by particular facts, or there were no evidence to prove these narratives, and some claims from different actors, and one of them I would say was that as if Georgia didn't take a neutral position in this conflict, and as if Georgia helped Azerbaijan and Turkey in this war. And I would say that that was definitely one of the hostile narratives that were kind of actively discussed in Georgia as well. And I also saw that some, and I would say quite a big number of Armenian actors also conveyed the same message. So we did a separate analysis on that. In particular, we noticed that some non-regional, completely external actors were trying to push the same narrative and to nurture an idea that Georgia is actually not really neutral, and Georgia kind of allowed Azerbaijan to transport military cargo, even though Georgian state specifically declared that since the eruption of the conflict, the country officially banned any transportation of military equipment through its territory or airspace. And again, we tried to debunk these narratives, but after all, it was really difficult for us, for researchers, to verify what type of cargo was being transported through the airspace. But one thing is for sure, that Armenian side also confirmed that they are in close cooperation with Georgian authorities, and they receive the information regarding the movement of the military, regarding the movement of the humanitarian or different types of cargo through Georgian territory. And officially, Armenia has never kind of stated that Georgia is actually allowing Azerbaijan or any other country to do that. So definitely that was one of the really hostile, and I think that Georgian state did not really respond to this narrative properly. And I think that there was still some room for Georgian authorities to provide some additional evidence or confirmations that there was just a movement of humanitarian cargo. But I also understand, on the other hand, that it was difficult for the Georgian state to check all the airplanes flying through its airspace. And apart from that, we of course also had an issue in the southern part of our country where ethnically Armenians live, and there are also some different regions populated by Azerbaijani people. So it was very, very crucial that there would not be kind of some confrontation on our territory, and we observed the situation there. We monitored the regional media outlets there, but I can't say that we had any particular really strong and viral narrative except what I already discussed. And basically, yeah, that's it from my side.
Պարոն Գրիգորյան, խնդրեմ ձեր տեսակետը Հայաստանի
Yes. Well, of course, the war created some new narratives and refreshed some older ones. And there have been some narratives going on like for decades already. So they are refreshed from time to time. And so about the West's moral decline, which you mentioned in the announcement, that's quite an old narrative which goes on and on, at least in Armenia, at least since the time of joining the Council of Europe, if not earlier. But what the war did regarding the West is that the kind of this betrayal narrative. So like they were expected to take some action, which they actually were not. It was something in the imagination of some people here in Armenia that the West owes us something, morally or otherwise. And so there were some expectations, and similar to the exaggerated expectations from some other players. which were not grounded actually, and maybe we can elaborate in more detail.
Շնորհակալ եմ, հետաքրքիր է ինչու են այդ նարատիվները պոպուլյար դառնում հենց քաղաքական ցնցումներից հետո եւ ձեր փորձագիտական գնահատականներով ինչ ընդհանրություն եք դուք տեսնում տարածաշրջանի տարբեր երկրներում հակալիբերալ պատմույթներում, ինչ ընդհանրություններ եւ ինչ տարբերություններ կան։ Զարինե, խնդրեմ։
I think a lot of the conspiracy theories about the West, the US and Europe in particular, in the context of the war, are founded on they're popular because they're based on some grains of truth. I think after the war and during it, there has been a lot of anger and hurt from Armenians towards the US and the EU and their relative disengagement from the Karabakh conflict. And as a result, that has provided the perfect seeding ground for various conspiracy narratives. One of the interesting things that circulated, it actually recirculated in the war, was a forged letter on social media that was it was written as if it was from Nikol Pashinyan to the Secretary General of NATO, and the letter basically asked Stoltenberg to be sure that Azerbaijan secures certain commitments under which its control will be reestablished over 50% of Nagorno-Karabakh. And the letter was a forgery, and we did analysis on it, as well as several experts in Armenia, including Samvel Martirosyan. And the interesting thing about it was originally seeded, when I looked at it, I saw it was originally seeded on back in June by the same persona, Gevorg Artunyan, on both an Azerbaijani forum and an Armenian forum. So whoever was responsible for this letter was clearly targeting both sides of the conflict. And it was very similar in terms of the style to what the DFR lab has seen in a previous operation that was linked to Russian intelligence called Secondary Infection, which was responsible for creating these forged letters to and seeding them on various social media using these one-off burner accounts that posted once and then never posted again, with the goal of seeding conspiracy narratives that undermine Western interests and unity. But the reason why those are popular is because of the genuine and authentic disillusionment, in a way, of Armenians who see Armenia's future fundamentally with the West.
Yeah, so I will briefly discuss our experience in Georgia, and I would say that this problem is quite common for both countries, for Armenia and for Georgia as well, because we also have quite active far-right movement in the country, and the main anti-West actors are also coming from the ranks of these far-right organizations. And of course, I would say that the primary goal of these actors is to nurture anti-Western sentiments within the public, and they try to really shape political discourse in the country. And it's very important to also analyze what kind of influence they have. And I would say that in Georgia, these anti-liberal actors are almost kind of omnipresent and in different political or societal fields. For instance, we have political parties, which one of them was part of the previous parliament, and two other parties decided to run for the previous elections. The elections we had in October, but they didn't really succeed to secure a lot of votes from the public. And then, apart from political parties, we also have non-governmental organizations, which again represent clearly anti-Western forces in the country. We also have the organizations, but not with the, I would say they are more like present on social network, and they are not formal registered organizations, but they still are quite active in social media. And we also have far-right groups in the streets, which are more radicals, more extremists, and they try to intimidate another segment of the society. And these all actors are trying to actively push anti-Western narratives, but on the other hand, they are also trying to portray themselves as not fully anti-Western. The point here is that they try to use conservative West as their role model, and they quote some European far-right leaders like Marine Le Pen or Orban or Salvini, and they say that they basically follow their path. And because they know that in Georgia, saying explicitly that I am an anti-liberal actor, or I'm against, anti-Western actor, or I'm strongly against the West, is not really something that can mobilize people around them. So they are trying to use different discursive approaches in order to conceal their clear messages, and on the other hand, still mobilize people. But also one interesting thing here is the role of Russia and role of the Kremlin. Unfortunately, many of far-right groups in Georgia are considered as pro-Kremlin. And when I said unfortunately, I mean Georgia is in a conflict with Russia, and 20% of country's territory is occupied by Russia. And the experience of Eastern European countries show that those countries which are not in a good relations with Russia, far-right groups in these countries are anti-Russian, not pro-Russian. If we take Ukraine, if we take Romania, if we take Latvia, which historically do not have perfect and friendly relations with Russia, far-right groups are against Russia. But in Georgia, despite an ongoing conflict between two countries, far-right groups are conveying Russian messages. Again, they try to conceal this, but if you read between the lines their statements, you will see that these are basically Kremlin messages. And also, this again goes hand in hand with the Kremlin's rhetoric towards the West. What Kremlin says regarding the Western countries, or even there was also conservatism mentioned there, which is completely new phenomena in Russia as well, and this like a new conservative turn, which is used by the Kremlin to show itself as morally superior to the West, because Russia knows that by all regards, it is lagging behind the Western countries, and Russia basically needs some new kind of metrics to be comparable with the West. And that's why Kremlin is pushing this idea that I'm conservative, so morally superior, even though West is economically, militarily, politically stronger than I am. And then of the Georgian and also probably Armenian far-right groups and anti-Western actors are repeating and pushing the same narrative. So there is again great deal of like a convergence between these actors in Armenia and Azerbaijan, in Georgia and Russia. And probably the common denominator here is that they want people to mobilize against the West and to really push more these ideas and the anti-Western narratives in order to shape the public discourse around it.
I kind of think of it as the convergence of the foreign disinformation ecosystem targeting Armenia and Georgia and the domestic disinformation ecosystem from within the country, where these domestic groups and purveyors of disinformation are contributing to the uptake of pro-Kremlin messaging and serving as domestic purveyors of this kind of messaging.
Well, indeed, concerning Georgia, I also noticed some activities by the Eurasian Institute and some other networks which, they use the Russian or Russia-centric narratives. Some even have relations with the known Eurasianist Dugin in Russia, perhaps. And, I remember a paper by Georgi Mchedlishvili published in 2016, Changing Perceptions of the West and the South Caucasus. It was a Chatham House publication where he compares the situation in Armenia and Georgia and shows how the alleged threat to Christian values and traditional family works, how the image of Russia as a conservative Christian entity superior to the nihilistic or decadent West is promoted. And also he mentioned this, what we may call whataboutism. So the Russian media portray Western societies as having the same issues like income inequality, corruption. So like they are not superior to us. Okay, we are not so good, they admit, even they can admit, but okay, the West isn't better. So they want to strip the West of any moral high ground. And also there are several studies by the Hungarian Political Capital Institute and others about the promotion of the same narrative about Russia as a guardian of traditional values in Central Europe and Southeastern Europe. So there are more or less common narratives, and they are used in Armenia and Georgia as well, although some narratives are not even that new, even some going back to mid-1990s. So even before there was this obvious, more or less obvious anti-Western turn in Russia, perhaps after the military engagement in Kosovo. Even before that, there were more or less similar narratives by some post-communist ethnic chauvinist groups in Central European democratizing countries at that time, EU candidates as well. So, for example, known Polish intellectual Adam Michnik mentions it, that in 1995 he wrote that there are groups partly related to the church, partly related to some nationalist groups which want to get closer links with the European Union, which they consider a new Babylon, a seat of sin and corruption, and so on. So I would say that with Russia's conservative turn on, or this pretending that they turned in that direction, they just reuse some narratives, but they also invest more in those, they also in media to promote it, and with social media available and other tools, they make those narratives even more effective than they used to be.
Սոցիալական մեդիայի դերին եւ ընդհանուր հանրության վրա ազդեցության առումով քիչ հետո կխոսենք, պարոն Գրիգորյան, կցանկանայի եւ հայկական հենց հայաստանյան համատեքստում ինչ տեսակի ինչ արժեքներ դավանող քաղաքական ուժերից են բխում այդ պատմույթները, մանիպուլար հանրությունը ապատեղեկատվությամբ եւ կեղծ լուրերով մանիպուլացվում է։
But where are the disinformation narratives stemming from? Was that the question?
Ինչ տեսակի իջարժեքներ դավանող, հա, քաղաքական ուժերից են բխում այդ պատմությունները։ Մասնավորապես պարոն Գրիգորյանին է ուղղված հարցը։ Ու Զարինեն, եթե հետազոտություններ կան ու կարող են
Well, in the last 3 years, those are, I would say, mostly the supporters of the previous Armenian authorities, which also seek some external support, and also they use some narratives of the so-called alt-right, maybe, but the narratives are also more or less, well, the selling Karabakh narrative, of course, is coming from the 90s, so they use it from time to time. And although it's a bit ironic that during, for example, Sargsyan presidency, also there were some attempts to use it against him as well, but some other narratives are also, well, LGBT related one is also a recurrent one. So our national and moral values are supposedly at risk. Well, this is also, this has been going on for about a decade or more, with the parents' committee, so-called parents' committee, appearing at the same time, like in Georgia or Ukraine or in Moldova, the 2011, 2012 maybe. So the allegations, even when also during Sargsyan presidency, some laws were adopted in accordance with commitments towards the Council of Europe or other international organizations, so equal rights laws, non-discrimination. At that time also this narrative was going on that, you know, they make it possible for foreign gays to adopt our children and take them and do something to them. But again, after 2018, people from ex-President Sargsyan's close circle who voted for those laws previously became strong opponents of ratification, or, for example, concerning the Istanbul Convention, this was the case. They made a big story out of that. Other narratives are, well, directly borrowed from Russia, like the Dulles Plan, which it was absurd and disastrous but funny at the same time, when an opposition MP in December 2019 quoted it directly during parliamentary hearings about the education reform. So like she was going like, the West wants to again destroy our values and spoil our children and next generations and so on and so forth. And there was a direct quote, which was also a few years earlier even used during some discussion at the Russian Ministry of Defense, and it was ascribed somehow to Mitt Romney at that time because he was the presidential candidate. So 2012, he if I'm not mistaken. So there are some narratives like that, and also what Zaina mentioned, some burner pages on Facebook. This was one of the ways how the narrative about Soros was promoted in Armenia. So there would be like a Facebook page. Many of them, actually, I remember this one, which was a burner because it just published, or they wrote for 1 or 2 days a couple of things and then deleted it. It was called Lerner Design, so the Voice of Mountains, and they introduced this Soros story, and then a newspaper, Hraparak, republished it, and other papers and sites already wrote about it, that, you know, according to Hraparak's sources, Soros is involved with these and those officials and so on. And this is actually this is an often used tool, you know. So they open a Facebook page or some blog or something, use it for introducing 1 or 2 narratives, and then they just leave it or even delete it. But several newspapers and websites write about it, like, according to our sources, something is going on, something bad, of course, something related to conspirological narratives about, again, the West or other alleged enemies of the state or the nation and so on.
Զարինի հետաքրքիր է ձեր հետազոտության արդյունքներով այդ նարատիվները, ինչպես պարոն Գրիգորյանը նշեց, որ սոցմեդիայում են տարածվում տարբեր խմբերի, դուք էլ ձեր խոսքում եք նշել, ինչ ազդեցություն են ունենում հանրության վրա եւ արձագանքներից նաեւ դատելով ինչ ազդեցություն են ունենում, խնդրեմ։
That's a great question, and I think measuring the impact of disinformation and disinformation campaigns is one of the hardest questions, because it's difficult to determine precisely how online behavior and content influences offline activity. But I can say, for example, I was monitoring the discussion about the Istanbul Convention in Armenia on social media, and on Facebook, at least, between May 2019 and December 2020, it received over 185,000 interactions, meaning like Facebook likes, comments, and the like, throughout that period. And the majority of the posts were extremely negative, and at times engaging in hate speech, targeting Armenian democracy activists, women, and the LGBT community, as well as attacking certain Armenian government officials who had expressed support for the ratification of the convention against gender-based violence. So it's hard to say exactly what effect this messaging has, but I can say that there's a portion of the public in Armenia that is certainly receptive to it. And it is particularly, I'm very worried about the effects on civil society, and including like human rights activists and
Որ հատվածն է մասնավորապես ներողություն,
yes, and yeah, and then there, as Adman mentioned, there's this entire network of websites, these fringe outlets in Armenian. I really like the term sankayin kaiker for them, like mushroom sites, that serve to rapidly disseminate a lot of the narratives that are appearing on social media in a sort of article format, and then they get reshared as if all of these are coming from different sources, when in fact many of these are managed by the same person or people. And then they also create Facebook pages and accounts that are further used to disseminate a lot of these articles.
I would just briefly say about the Georgian experience. As Zareen mentioned, probably this is also one of the biggest kind of question in our field, how to measure an actual impact of disinformation on people's minds. And so far, we are able to measure the spread of different disinformation narratives and engagements. As Zareen already said, like how many people reacted to this particular disinformation story. However, still, we don't know what actual actions the people who are exposed to this information take after hearing or reading, or just after they kind of are exposed to this information. But in Georgia, we still try to do that. And I can just bring one example. As you know, Georgia has a declared pro-Western course, and we are trying to join different Euro-Atlantic institutions, And there are regular surveys conducted in Georgia, in all regions, to measure how and what's support of Georgia's aspiration towards Euro-Atlantic institutions. And in minority settlements in Georgia, the support to pro-European course is the lowest at the local level and among different regions. And when we ask these people why don't they support Georgia's pro-European course, their arguments are in line with some disinformation narratives or Kremlin's narratives. So this is one of the ways how we try to measure it, the impact. And we know that people do not support Georgia's pro-Western course because of what they read in Russian magazines or in Russian media, or what they watch in Russian TVs. So one of the solutions, I think, is to have a continuous and regular surveys, like once in a quarter or once in 3 months or so and so forth, or in the particular, in the specific segment of society, which is exposed to this information, and then measure to what extent their beliefs are changing along the way once they read this information stories and once they are exposed to that. And we have one quite big USAID-funded project in Georgia, and this is one of the deliverables of this project, that we are starting to measure the impact of this information on the public, and how they kind of change their behavior after they are exposed to this information.
Պարոն Գրիգորյան, կա այս հարցի առնչությամբ հայաստանյան, հենց իրականության մասով ինչ ազդեցություն է, եթե կան դիտարկումներ կամ ուսումնասիրություններ կամ գնահատական ուղղակի։
Well, Armenia doesn't have a pro-Western course, so our politicians, also in the opposition, are usually a bit too cautious about this. But the thing is, some opposition politicians also think that perhaps they might use, Russian support in order to solve their domestic problems. So if they think that they may use support for coming to power, they would, like now, you see some people say, okay, we need a second Russian military base, or some things like that. It's an attempt to win support for solving domestic issues. although they can hardly beat the current government. And on the other side, of course, the radical opposition has been saying that the government destroyed the relations with Russia. That's why we lost the war, or that's why we are going to lose even more, and this is a disastrous and catastrophe. But it all has some domestic issues to solve primarily, and maybe could you perhaps like develop the question more exactly concerning the narratives? Well, the West, the West is something, the majority of political forces want some, perhaps, they like the perks they can get from the West, also when the previous government, when they were in power, but they would try to avoid like being seen as pro-Western, so they try to sit on both chairs sometimes, like get whichever material perks they get from the one side and political support from the other. So, and the population is not very well informed about what the Western values really mean, and because of they get messages via politicians or via some NGOs, via media, which have their own agenda, perhaps.
Զարինե, դուք ձեր խոսքում նշեցիք, որ իհարկե կարելի ասել աղբյուրը մեկն է պատմույթի, բայց դրանք տարածվում են, եւ քանի որ պարոն Գրիգորյանն էլ մեդիայից խոսեց, հետաքրքիր է հայաստանյան մեդիա դաշտը ինչ կարգավորման խնդիրներ ունի այս առնչությամբ, ապա տեղեկատվությունը չտարածելու համար, եւ ամեն դեպքում հարցը հնչեցնեմ, կա մի կենտրոն, որտեղ ձևավորվում, ծնվում է հենց այդ պատմույթը։
That's a good question. Armenia and as well as Georgia are in a tough position in terms of how to combat disinformation because they're small markets, for example, social media companies. They don't have the necessary market power to necessarily force the deplatforming of some of the purveyors of disinformation. For example, in the US, one thing we are seeing with the recent attack on the Capitol is the deplatforming by social media companies of domestic extremists, as well as the former president, Donald Trump. That is very unlikely to happen in Armenia. There has been some talk about regulation that restricts freedom of speech under the guise of regulating disinformation. There are a couple of, I think, unaddressed issues in it. One of them, which I'm worried about, is the conflation of hate speech and disinformation. Hate speech being targeted attacks on protected groups or groups that should be protected, like ethnic minorities as well as other groups. But one of the things that's interesting is that Armenia's media, and part of the problem is Armenia's media environment is very, very free, but very, very polarized in that a lot of the, there are a lot of the outlets with large followings on social media as well are in the hands of allies of former president of Armenia, Robert Kocharian. And these outlets are responsible for a lot of the messaging. However, I think completely restricting these outlets' speech would be seen as a politically motivated move, and it may as well be. So I think in Armenia, the primary responses to disinformation does need to come from civil society. And I think there have been some very, very huge Haskayakan efforts in that regard. There are a lot of Armenian civil society organizations and fact-checking organizations that monitor and put out great work on disinformation in Armenia, media.am, FIP, as well as others. So I think Armenia does have the civil society capacity in place to combat disinformation. But I think this current wave of anti-liberal, anti-NGO sentiment risks, threatens that capacity. And I think that should be one of the priorities of the Armenian government going forward in terms of combating disinformation, because it becomes a national security threat at a certain point.
Yeah, I would say that crucial here is the whole of society approach to effectively fight against disinformation. And we at the FR Lab are using 4 lines of defense against disinformation tactic. And basically it has 4 main points. And the first one is to document the threats, to know the scale of the problem, or let's call it a threat, meaning how many different channels are spreading this information, how many people are exposed to that, how many messages are conveyed on a daily basis. And I think state and non-state actors should have this information. It's crucial. And Georgia has been documenting these threats since probably 2017. And there are, as of today, just non-governmental organizations who are doing that. And government is still, I think, is ignoring this problem, and there is no enough effort from their side. But we already have more or less good understanding of this disinformation landscape. And then second kind of step here is to raise an awareness about the problem and communicate the significance of this problem to the audience, to have like specific campaigns in order to bring this to the people who are the most vulnerable and exposed to this information. And then third action that society and government should be doing is to repair those weaknesses that exist in the country and malicious actors are exploiting. Because if you look at Kremlin, for example, which is the main source of the information in Georgia specifically, in this case, they are exploiting already existing weaknesses in the society. They don't really create new ones. But government and society should be doing a lot to fix it and to not to allow malicious actors to kind of use them. And I would say, last but not least, you need to also raise stakes for those actors who are spreading this information. And we have plenty of examples in Eastern Europe. And I think it's particularly relevant for Georgia that maybe 3 days ago, Ukraine banned a couple of pro-Kremlin outlets, which were working specifically to convey Kremlin's messages. We have the same situation in Baltic countries, right, where Sputnik has been having continuously problems because of subjective reporting. And in general, punishment for such actors is crucial, because if you don't really take responsibilities and if they don't pay any price, they will just freely continue what they are doing. And it also applies to the domestic actors as well. But again, there is really thin line between censoring and rights and freedom of expression, and also kind of punishing them by different measures.
Զարինե, լրացում եք։
Yes, so I think I agree with Givi, and I think that the problem is when disinformation or the specter of disinformation is used sort of as a political cudgel. And I think, for example, that has been the case in the US for sure over the past 4 years in particular, with claims of fake news, right, lobbed at the other side to the point where the term has become essentially meaningless. And it's one of the reasons that the DFR lab doesn't really use it in our research, because it's not particularly useful. I think a lot of these concerns about the politicization of fake news and the threat of fake news also apply in Armenia, and drive some of the government's responses to disinformation. Back in last year, the NSS, the Armenian Security Services, arrested an individual for allegedly making certain social media posts online under a fake profile, Diana Harutyunyan, and brought the guy behind the account supposedly in for questioning. And there was a rather bombastic, dramatic video filmed of his confession and the like. And I think these efforts are, and he was eventually, I suppose, let go, and we heard very little about that case afterward. So I think that efforts like that are counterproductive in a sense, because they involve for the selective enforcement of countermeasures to disinformation, and, for example, criminal prosecution of disinformation agents for politically motivated reasons. And it's important to develop a framework for combating disinformation that avoids that selective enforcement and sort of ad hoc approach of arresting a political opponent under the guise of countering fake news and then letting him go because there's no particular law or legislation under which they can be legitimately prosecuted. And developing that framework will help in a way sort of also legitimize counter-disinformation efforts and prevent them from being used by opponents as evidence of censorship or political bias.
Պարոն Գրիգորյան,
well, I also think we need a better developed strategy to counter fake news or conspiracy theories, hate speech, and so on. doesn't just take arresting someone or a few persons even, and it would be, I think, a wrong strategy to make this make use of repressive measures more widespread. But instead, a better communication strategy is needed, and also reliance on civil society, on some reliable information sources and so on. But the problem is that currently the Armenian government may feel isolated because a large segment of civil society feels alienated because of some bad communication during the war, or the absence of some critical reforms, or indefinite postponement of some critical reforms even before the war, like the promised vetting or judicial reform and so on. So, and as the government probably doesn't feel safe to trust this civil society segment to a larger extent, they may be trying to use their own some propaganda tools or some restrictive laws against false narratives, which is not so productive because they will be lagging behind anyway. Some new tools will appear, the restrictions will be circumvented somehow, and in the absence of a good communication strategy, it's hardly possible to win that battle.
Շնորհակալություն, եւ որպես ամփոփում հետաքրքիր է ինչ հակաեվրոպական, հակալիբերալ քարոզչության պատմույթների, այսպես բեռով ենք, այսպես ասած բեռով ենք մուտք գործել 2021 թվական, եւ այդ բեռը, այսպես ասած, հասարակական քաղաքական արժեքների համակարգի եւ արտաքին քաղաքական, քաղաքակրթական ընկալումների վրա ինչ ազդեցություն կարող է ունենալ։
I think one of the things, for example, that we're going to see in 2021 is more messaging about how Russia is the only credible protector of security of Armenia. And I expect also particularly to see increasing attacks on Armenian civil society and NGOs in particular that are focused on strengthening Armenia's democratic resilience yes, so I see a continuation of what we've basically seen, these attacks on Western cultural mores and values as combined with a politically motivated attacks on Nikol Pashinyan and the government and efforts to link the government's perceived failures in the recent war to the administration's alignment with the West, rather than to what it partially really was, which was the failure to develop adequate relations with the West to allow Armenia to have alternative options.
I would say that in Georgia, probably the most prevalent disinformation narratives will be still related to COVID pandemic in 2021. Nowadays, plenty of pro-Kremlin outlets are writing about advantages of Russian vaccine, Sputnik, and how it is better than some European vaccines. And definitely Russia will continue its effort to blame a lot of bad things on US-funded Richard Lugar's laboratory, which has been the main target of Kremlin disinformation in Georgia. And I would say it's quite a convenient target, so to say, for pro-Kremlin actors, and they will continue attacking it again. Apart from that, situation in terms of economy is quite bad in Georgia, and it's getting worse. And external actors, I mean, malicious actors, will try to convince the society that being closer to Russia and being dependent on Russian economy can be a remedy for Georgia's economic problems, and this effort will continue again. Far-right groups are getting higher visibility, and unfortunately, these groups are being instrumentalized by multiple actors, such as church or also government, to and they are instrumentalized and used to fight against the political opponents or against whoever they want. And that's why they are getting more visibility in the country. Recently, the TV channel was launched by one of the most active far-right group. They are conducting kind of solidarity campaigns in social media and asking people to express solidarity and join these campaigns towards anti-liberal groups, because these far-right groups believe that social media platforms are blocking them because of their anti-liberal content, but this is not true at all. They are just doing actions and behavior, undertaking behavior in social media which runs against the standards of Facebook, for example, and the internal rules. But still, they are trying to present themselves as the victims of Western social media platforms or Western countries, or in general victims of liberalism and neoliberalism, which is very important in Georgian context. Because for them, and as many populist forces in Georgia say, all sides are divided into two parts. One is elite, which is liberal and pro-Western, and then people, and there is always a huge gap between these two. This is what they kind of try to promote in Georgia. So these are basically 3 or 4 main trends that I think we will be observing for what they are, and in 2022 as well.
Yes, concerning the issue that we are kind of being abandoned by the West, so the Russia can be the only savior, provider of security, that will somehow be combined at the same time with the narrative about the West's aggressiveness. So they kind of abandoned us, but they at the same time want to destroy our traditional values, so the family institute as an institution, a social institution, and so on. And concerning COVID narratives, well, the narrative about vaccine being a tool for inserting microchips or changing the genetic code, our national genetics, I don't know what it is, but that narrative was very popular until the moment when the Russians said that we are the first. Yeah, we got the vaccine, the first in the world. Since then, that narrative became more marginalized, but it is being transformed into something that, in terms of procurement, the Western companies will fail to deliver, and you see the EU also has problems. So still Russia is the one to rescue us. So they are the only one capable of providing the needed vaccine, but probably the anti-vaccine narrative will get stronger yet again. And other narratives, the verbal and psychological attacks on some NGOs, the so-called Soros network perhaps, will go on because these are well coordinated, and that kind of activity is getting some external support as well, both ideologically and otherwise. And some people simply have to go on with it in order to remain on the scene, so they would not be forgotten, or unless they can invent something more scary, which without some external consultants or some political consultants, or as in Russian they would say curator, they cannot even invent. So they should somehow proceed with this, and it's already a familiar narrative which they use quite aptly, and they may go on with it. And if they see they can push for some more violent action without being restricted or punished, then they may try to move in that direction as well, because that would also suit the goal of destabilizing the political situation. And also, of course, intimidating people from NGOs or some foundations and so on.
Շնորհակալություն, հարգելի բանախոսներ, բավական հետաքրքիր եւ արդյունավետ քննարկման համար։ Ես հիշեցնեմ, որ մեդիա կենտրոնը անցկացրեց առցանց քննարկում 2020 թվականի հակաարևմտյան հակալիբերալ տրամադրությունները Կովկասում պրոպագանդայի խոհանոցի ներսում թեմայով։ Մեր բանախոսներն էին Զարինե Խարազյան, Ատլանտյան խորհրդի Digital Forensic Research Lab-ի խմբագիր, Գիվի Գիգիթաշվիլի, Ատլանտյան խորհրդի հետազոտող եւ Արմեն Գրիգորյան, քաղաքականության հետազոտական կենտրոնի փոխնախագահ։ Շնորհակալ եմ հարգելի բանախոսներ, հաջողություն։